Hello, everyone. My name is David Cropley, and I'm the Professor of Engineering Innovation at the University of South Australia. And the purpose of this LIFT learning activity is to add some further detail, some additional explanation about the paper that I recently had published in the journal Learning Letters. And so I'd like to share my screen with you in a moment, scroll through some aspects of the paper and add some additional detail, a little bit more nuance and discussion to perhaps help make it as clear as possible what I'm investigating in that paper. And of course, the subject that the paper is about is looking at the question of ChatGPT in particular, or you might say AI more broadly, and this question of whether or not it's possible for this sort of technology to exhibit creativity. So I'll share my screen now with you. Just bear with me for a moment while I do that. And like I said, I'd like to try and sort of add a little bit more value and explain that in a little bit more detail. And I would like to add at this point that if you've read the paper and if you've listened to this LIFT learning activity and you still have questions or comments that you want to make, then of course you're more than welcome to get in touch with me and we can discuss it further. So here on the screen you can see the paper. This paper is artificial intelligence more creative than humans? And I'm looking at ChatGPT and in particular one test of creativity. But I'll begin by adding a little bit more detail in relation to the introduction. So we know that, I describe in the paper that an important conversation around creativity is around this whole concept of the future of work. And up until very recently, at least, the premise of the future of work is that AI and robots, technology in general, is pretty good at doing things that are predictable and algorithmic in nature, whether that's placing parts in a box in a factory or automatically welding parts of cars together. That's the kind of work that we could see a real benefit and future of in relation to technology, robotics, and even now AI. But there was always still the premise that humans were a little bit different because we were good at doing unpredictable, non-algorithmic, both cognitive and physical work. So things that required interaction with other humans, things that required complex decision-making in changing and changeable circumstances, and of course, things that required creativity. However, since the recent advent of large language models or generative AI, like ChatGPT, we're suddenly beginning to see, in a short space of time, a lot of claims saying AI is creative. In fact, I've already seen a number of papers that flat out make that claim. So it's important to investigate that claim and see how it holds up under the microscope of some empirical testing, some experimental evidence. So before I get into the details of that, and by way of adding to what's already in the paper, there's really an important sort of side note that I want to expand on. It's clear to me, both from many years of being a creativity researcher and observing myths and misconceptions around creativity, as well as in recent online discussions, that there's still quite a lot of confusion about what creativity is. And there's confusion with the words, there's confusion with some of the concepts that sit behind the words. So I'd like the first thing I'd like to do by way of adding to this paper is to try and clarify that definitional issue a little bit and to clear up some of these myths and misconceptions. The first thing to say is that many people confuse creativity and the concept of creating. And it's really an unfortunate semantic accident that those two words share a lot of letters. And of course, they derive from the same basic core, but they mean very different things. So to be clear, when I talk to you about creativity, what I mean is creativity in the sense of the scientific field of study that looks at the ability of humans and now machines to generate effective and novel outputs. So it's about understanding the processes by which we arrive at those outputs and also the qualities of those outputs, the things that make outputs creative. The point here is that creativity is not simply the production of things, which is how the word creating is sometimes used. I created a picture. Doesn't necessarily mean that that picture is creative, we use the term create there simply as a synonym for produced. We have to be very careful with the terminology there. So whatever we do, the things produced, if we want to talk about creativity, the things produced have to be creative in the sense that they are both effective, they do what they're supposed to do, and they're novel. In other words, they're new, or they're original, or we sometimes say surprising, or perhaps never before seen. But it's those two qualities of products, effectiveness and novelty, that are really critical here. It's not just the fact that we made something. Now, another point of confusion is that creativity is also not an all or nothing phenomenon. It's not something that you either have or you don't have. And it's also not something that is either present in a product or absent. There are degrees of. So this means that people and the outputs they generate can be devoid of creativity, or they can have a little bit of creativity, or they can have a lot of creativity. It exists, in other words, on a continuum. That also means that while something can be creative for you or for me, we could say it's personally creative, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's creative for everyone. So what we could say is universally creative. We have to make a kind of broader distinction there of this personal, this idea that it can be new to you, it can be creative to you, but not new to other people, or it can be universally creative. So there's some important nuances there, but although I do agree that creativity is a complex phenomenon, being complex doesn't mean that we can't understand it. There's also one more useful point to clarify about the continuum of creativity. Outputs at the lower end of the continuum, if they have creativity, this tends to be what I would call incremental creativity, or it's incremental in nature. In other words, their newness tends to be based on new forms or new combinations of what already exists. And this is a critical point as well. You might say, therefore, that their novelty is a kind of small n novelty. A key here is that this kind of novelty is inherently limited because there are only so many different ways that you can rework what already exists. In contrast, outputs towards the upper end of the continuum also tend to show a kind of paradigm-breaking quality in addition to this incremental quality. In other words, they go beyond merely reworking what already exists, and they introduce things that are completely new, that really have never been seen before in any sense. So we might call that big N novelty. Now, of course, the kind of creativity that involves paradigm breaking is rarer, and it's harder to achieve. There's no doubt about that. But it does exist. And we usually see it, of course, in eminent individuals. Think of, your Mozarts or your Da Vinci's. The key point, though, is that humans are capable in some instances of this paradigm-breaking creativity. And something that I don't really go into in this paper is that generative AI is, I believe, fundamentally limited to what it's been trained on. So we're going to find that generative AI has difficulty progressing beyond incremental creativity. It's got a kind of fundamental upper limit that's not the same as what humans are capable of. However, back to the question of AI and creativity, it seems very reasonable that before we accept any claims that AI is creative, we should expect some evidence of that. This is especially important because if it's true, it's going to have a major impact on the future of work. It's also important to test these claims because organizations already are making decisions based on what they think to be true, often without any real or empirical evidence. And that in some ways is more dangerous than anything. It's a more dangerous situation than even if AI turns out to be highly creative. I'll give you an example that's quite topical right now. We hear a lot about film and TV production companies already replacing human writers with AI. Indeed, it's topical because that's been part of the reason why the writers in the US have been on strike until very recently. In fact, I think today they've just, after 4 months, I think, resolved that strike. And an important part of that strike was about the role of AI replacing human writers. Now, the point for me is that there is precious little concrete evidence right now that AI creativity is far superior to humans, and yet production companies have been making decisions as though they know for a fact that AI is more creative. Now, I think, in other words, they're making decisions based on really hearsay and rumor rather than on empirical evidence. And I don't think that's a wise path for any organization to follow, not just in relation to creativity, but in a lot of things. You wouldn't just adopt a new technology or a new idea without some sort of evidence that it does what it claims. So in this paper, I asked the question, is AI creative? And unlike some other recent publications, I've avoided stating a conclusion. In other words, I've avoided saying AI is creative or AI is not creative. I've kept the question as an open question because it needs to be tested empirically. And until some evidence really starts to roll in, we should keep an open mind. So let's give an AI, such as ChatGPT, a recognized test that links in some way to creativity, and let's see what the evidence tells us before we jump to any conclusions. And that's basically what this paper is about. So if I roll down a little bit, and one reason I want to have the paper on screen is so that you can see a couple of the graphs and figures, is that I want to now tell you a little bit more about the test that I actually gave ChatGPT, and you can see a bit of the detail on screen now as well. And I'll talk a bit more about that and then talk about the results. So the way that I chose to gather this evidence, to explore this question, is AI creative, was through a thing called the Divergent Association Task, or the DAT. Now, this is a test of verbal divergent thinking, and it's ideally suited to ChatGPT because it's nicely aligned with the verbal medium of ChatGPT. So it makes sense to give it a test that ChatGPT has some chance of doing well at. And it's a test that ChatGPT also can do well at without any special modification. We can literally just give it the same instructions that we'd give a human. So we're making a direct comparison. We're comparing apples with apples. And we can see how ChatGPT compares on this test relative to how humans perform on the test. On the screen, you can see the instructions. Very simply, you are asked to come up with a list of 10 words, and there's some rules there. They have to be single words in English, only nouns, and so on. And then the people who devised this test actually have a website. You may even have done it yourself, and you can enter the words in there. You get a score based on their algorithm and so on. And so we've got a nice, very objective way of comparing a measure of ChatGPT creativity with a measure of human creativity. It's important to note here, however, that the DAT is not a test of creativity per se. Divergent thinking is an important part of creative thinking, but it's not everything. Therefore, no matter what happens with this test, we also have to remember that divergent thinking gives us some insight into creativity, but we shouldn't regard it as the definitive measure. There are other aspects of creativity that are important as well. Nevertheless, it's widely used as, let's say, a proxy for creativity. So it's a good starting point to answer this question, is AI creative? Now, as far as comparing to humans is concerned, the other good thing about the DAT is that the team that developed it has a very large human sample that we can compare the results to. In fact, they've published the details of a sample of nearly 9,000 people who've done the DAT. So that's going to be our baseline for comparing the performance of ChatGPT. And if I scroll down a little bit more, you can see some, I'll just leave it there for a second. You can see some of the numbers there. The first couple of lines relate to the human sample, or our norm. That's the nearly 9,000 humans. And then you'll see, and I'll explain in a minute, that I've gathered some data from two versions of ChatGPT. So the earlier version was based on the GPT 3.5 model, and the more recent version based on GPT-4. Now, another consideration here is that we can't simply take one response from ChatGPT and compare it to humans. If you ask 100 humans or 9,000 humans to take the DAT, you'll get 100 different, or you'll get 9,000 different responses. The responses from the humans tend to form, like many measures of human things, ranging from people's height to their creativity, they tend to form a normal distribution. And let me scroll down and just remind you what I mean by that. There's the normal distribution of human responses on the DAT. Now, it turns out that ChatGPT has a similar distribution to its responses. And therefore, in order to get a fair comparison or a good picture of the typical ChatGPT response, we have to ask ChatGPT to repeat the divergent association task a number of times and build up a similar curve or a similar distribution of its responses. That way, we get a reliable picture of the distribution of ChatGPT responses to this test. So what I did is I asked ChatGPT to repeat the DAT about 100 times, and you can see that back in the table here. In fact, I did it 102 times. And this proved to be sufficient to get a meaningful distribution, and therefore to be able to say that we're making a fair statistical comparison between humans and between the two different forms of the GPT model. So the next question then is, what did I find? If we go to the results. Now, the results, the core of the results here is really this table, but so I'll leave it there for a moment, and I'll talk you through what some of the statistical tests are and what they told me. If you look now, in fact, at figure 2, let me scroll down here for you. This is what I meant to show you, this graph here. Let me just get it nicely positioned on the page. If you look at this graph here, it's easiest to see what the results are really telling us. On that diagram, there are 3 curves, and you can see them there. These represent the distributions of the responses for the humans. That's the lower, darker, solid curve. And the responses for GPT 3.5, that's the normal curve in the middle, and GPT 4, which is the one higher up to the right. And you can also see in the figure that the dotted lines there represent the mean values for each of those 3 groups, the humans, GPT 3.5, and GPT 4. So I tried to make it as easy as possible to visualize what was on that previous table. Now, as far as the mean scores, you can think of average scores there. As far as those are concerned, you can see that the differences are pretty clear. The mean score for GPT 3.5, GPT 4 on the DAT was 85.28. So that's the one farthest to the right, the highest one. The mean score of GPT 3.5 was 80.89. And the mean score for humans, you can see there, was 78.2. Now, looking at that, it's very tempting to jump to the conclusion and stop there and say, well, it's clear. ChatGPT, both forms, are superior to humans on this test of divergent thinking. And insofar as divergent thinking is a reasonable proxy for creativity, then it would be tempting to say that ChatGPT is more creative than humans. However, I think we've got to be a little bit more cautious, and there's a little bit more to it than that we have to drill into. The first cautionary note I'd give you is found in what's called the effect size of the differences that we actually see on those graphs. Now, statistically speaking, there's no denying that the GPT means are higher than the human means. That's just an arithmetic fact. But in statistical terms, this thing called effect size tells us that this difference in this particular case is only small. Now, effect sizes can be very small, they can be medium, they can be large. But when an effect size is very small, or small, as was the case in this particular instance, we often say, writing up results like this, that therefore the difference between these means was of little practical significance. That's a very important statement. That's a statistician's way of saying that the difference between the humans and ChatGPT was really no big deal. Another way I would sometimes frame it in colloquial terms is that there's really no daylight between those distribution curves. There's no clear sort of gap between them that you could definitively say under all circumstances one is better than the other. But we have a proper statistical measure there, effect size. It was low or small in this case. Therefore, really those differences are of little practical significance. It's certainly not big enough to, for example, declare that AI is more creative than humans and to start sacking all of your writers if you're running a film or TV production company. I'd at least wait for some further evidence. Now, the next piece of evidence of a cautionary nature is the next thing you can see on the graph is that there's a lot of overlap of the curves themselves. And what you can see is that despite the fact that GPT 3.5 and 4 have higher means than the humans, there is still quite a high proportion of humans who score above the means for the two GPTs. In other words, it's that part of the curve, the solid darker curve, that actually extends above the means of the GPT curves. Now, it's not a huge proportion of the humans, but it is still a proportion. And what this means is that there are still some humans that scored better than just the average score of GPT 3.5 or 4. Another way to look at this is look at the lower ends of those curves. And you can also say that conversely, there must be quite a few instances where a given response on the DAT from either GPT 3.5 or 4 actually falls below the human mean. So there are a lot of cases there where either a given human might score higher than ChatGPT, or instances where a given case, a given response from ChatGPT might be very low even compared to humans. Put it another way, if you were to randomly select a human and randomly select a response from GPT-4, there is still a roughly 17% chance that the human score will be better than ChatGPT or GPT-4. Now, it's true that those odds still heavily favor ChatGPT, but I take the view of, would you bet your house on it? If you were running a business that depended on getting these decisions right, would you be confident enough to get rid of the humans and rely on ChatGPT? Or another way to think of it, if you knew that you had a human employee who was a good divergent thinker and consistently scored well above average on this test, wouldn't you prefer that human to the lottery ticket of a random response from ChatGPT? You might get a good response and a high score from ChatGPT, but you also might get a really bad one. So a good human is not only good, but reliably good compared to this randomness that you get from ChatGPT. And that, to me, is just risky enough to call into question the usefulness of ChatGPT in regard to things like this test. So there are some reasons to be cautious about the divergent thinking ability of ChatGPT and some reasons to hold off before you start replacing humans with ChatGPT for tasks that require creativity. There's also one more interesting weakness, I think, in the ChatGPT responses, and you can see that in table 2 that I'm just bringing up onto the screen now. And again, let me just get it up so that it is nicely positioned there. This other weakness is you can see in table 2 that both forms of ChatGPT, or the GPT 3.5 and 4, have a habit of repeating themselves. In simple terms, ChatGPT has what seems to be some favorite words that it likes to use. And any given time that you do this test, there are a surprising number of words that pop up surprisingly frequently. You can see in the case of GPT 3.5, it loved the word mirage. And 19 times out of 102, so almost 1 in 5 times, it would use that word. GPT-4 was a little better, but still came very close to 1 in 10 times using the word lighthouse, and just slightly less frequently using the word dolphin, elephant, and so on. Now, because they have a habit of repeating themselves, in simple terms, ChatGPT has certain favorite categories of words as well. You can see on those lists that, for example, it likes giving some words that relate to a kind of animal, or in some of them also a kind of geographic feature also occurred a lot. Or another common category was feelings like serenity and euphoria. So there are some interesting elements of repetition and a lack of variety that also call into question the underlying creativity of ChatGPT. Now, the problem with this is that if we can predict some of the responses that ChatGPT will include in any given set of words, then you can't really call it highly creative. Because one important essence of creativity that I mentioned at the start of this is novelty, it's newness or surprisingness. And if ChatGPT is often repeating itself, that by definition is not surprising. So there's a chink in the armor there of this claim that ChatGPT is more creative than humans. If ChatGPT has a tendency to reuse favorite words, it's not being as creative as it could be. Okay, well, at that point, I'd like to begin to wrap it up. There's a lot more that we could talk about, but I really just wanted to sort of add some extra thoughts and talk you through a few elements of the paper, clarify what I mean by creativity, and then just wrap up my position that I'm extracting from this evidence so far. So what should we conclude about the creative capacity of ChatGPT? Well, as you might have guessed, I'm taking a very cautious approach, not because I dislike AI, or have some fundamental position against generative AI. I don't have a preconceived position on this matter. I'm just being cautious because that's how any research should be done. Take the example of a medical company. When a medical company develops a new wonder drug, or you could even take the example of COVID vaccines, we don't just take their word for it and start popping pills without regard for possible side effects. We expect those companies to do extensive trials to prove their claims. In fact, that's enshrined in law in many countries. And it should be the same in this case of AI and creativity. It's not enough to take the claims of the companies making these tools at face value. In other words, just because OpenAI says that ChatGPT is creative doesn't mean that there's any empirical evidence to support this. We have to differentiate between marketing slogans and real evidence, because the impact on jobs, the impact on the future of work, and in fact, the impact on the future of education as well, is potentially massive and could lead to unintended consequences, where it could lead us to start embedding elements in education that are the wrong thing, things that are not required, or it could mean that we fail to educate people to do certain things, and we'll find that we regret that decision later on. That's why these claims need to be empirically tested, not just because it's interesting, but because it has real-world consequences. And these claims need to be treated with caution. And of course, if it turns out that ChatGPT is far more creative than the best humans, then I'll be the first to admit it. However, so far, when we properly and rigorously test these claims, I'm certainly finding that the claims so far are overhyped. That may change in the future with newer versions of these tools, or with more and more testing of their creativity. But what I am seeing at this stage is that the evidence simply doesn't support the claims that AI is more creative than humans. It certainly has a degree of creativity, but as I said earlier on, I believe that that comes up against a hard barrier of incremental creativity. And if you want real paradigm-breaking, radical creativity, it's still humans that have that capability. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this LIFT learning activity, and that I hope you found the paper interesting. And once again, if you have any questions or any points that you would like to clarify further, I think you can find my contact details on the paper, or of course on the web, and so you're more than welcome to get in touch. Thank you very much, and I hope to do one of these again.